In the summer of 2025, conservative political groups, payment processors, banks, and self publishing storefronts joined forces to crack down on legal speech in America. Pressure from the Australian faux feminist conservative group Collective Shout led to certain NSFW games being removed from both Steam and Itch. Itch would respond to this pressure by removing all erotic games, only for them to be relisted if they were offered up for free. You were not allowed to make money. My previous entry into this censorship series goes over that saga in some detail. At the time I wrote and released that video, I was filled with optimism. Much of the internet made some noise over this. Anna Valens, one of the reporters I cite in that video, continues to be on the case. PayPal, Stripe, MasterCard, and Visa were being flooded with calls and emails. Petitions gained thousands of signatures. When MasterCard attempted to lie about not censoring legal content, people pointed to the same terms of service I mentioned in my past two videos. Valve, the owners of Steam, explicitly pointed the finger at the credit card company. It seemed, perhaps, we would see a repeat of the fight between Smashwords and PayPal, where authors ultimately came out victorious. At least for the most part. My first entry in the censorship series covers that situation in more detail, as well as the resulting censorship and vaguely anti-art guidelines Smashwords was forced to adopt. 2025 is not 2012, however. The fight and the focus seem to be dying down. Much to my chagrin, I have not seen many leftist content creators or influencers posting about the situation. To be fair to them, I refuse to watch streamers because I love myself too much to subject myself to that. While Hassan Piker doesn't appear to have made any commentary about it on social media, it does seem like he's covered it on stream at least once back in July. I have no idea if he's continued to speak out about it, and given his large following, I do wish he brought it up on his other accounts. I started to go through the social media accounts of the leftist and liberal YouTubers I enjoyed, or at least know of. My initial aim here when I was doing this was to point out the lack of coverage this was actually getting. However, I realized partway through this that would, one, take a lot of my time, and would, two, also amount to something I despise, a name and shame campaign. Despite what many social media activists like to pretend to believe, not speaking up about an issue is not a sin. More importantly, treating it as one risks negatively polarizing people against you. As much as we like to talk about how negative polarization shouldn't affect us, it's cope to pretend that it doesn't. We can hold ourselves to that standard, but holding others to it doesn't change human tendencies. It simply makes us less effective activists and communicators. This is how you wind up with self-righteous internet mobs who go around feeling as though throwing around their anger at random people is the height of activism, while at the same time expressing extreme hostility to the very idea that they should perhaps be more concerned with educating and convincing others. That's a conversation for another time, though, I suppose. The long and short of it is this: you catch more flies with honey. You can hate that all you want, but it is true. All of that is to say that this hasn't picked up much traction outside of gaming circles. I follow a lot of creative-minded people on Blue Sky, for instance, and many of my writer friends seem to be silent on this issue. As we'll get to when talking about recent moves from PayPal, this is a grave mistake that will threaten their own livelihoods and art. On other accounts, I follow plenty of adult models, actors, filmmakers, writers, and artists. Similarly, many of them seem to have no interest in discussing or defending their art against censorship, perhaps out of fear that discussing something political like that, daring to be so pretentious as to correctly call themselves artists and what they make art, could cause them to lose subscribers, lose their spot in the algorithm, and lose some dollars in their bank accounts. There is a fear, based on facts and trends, that people who want erotic art want its artists to shut the hell up. This is, of course, true of every art form. You'll see many of those types of comments lobbed at musicians, actors, and any other sort of creative. It's a form of dehumanization. I talked about this a little bit more in depth in my essay discussing the dehumanization of Taylor Swift, but this sort of thing runs rampant. Both fans and haters engage in it regularly. When you combine this general disdain for artists with the dehumanization openly sexual people in general and sex workers in specific already go through, Now, if you combine those two sources of dehumanization with the fact that many don't consider erotic art to be art or the creation of it to be work, and therefore want all of this output for free, you get a massive firestorm of cruelty and dismissal. People do not want to stand up for artists. They don't want to stand up for games as an art form, and they especially do not want to stand up for erotic video game developers. As of the beginning of September, when I am writing this essay before I fell quite ill and couldn't speak for a week or so, the payment processors seem to find all of this to be quite stressful. Yet, despite that, they currently show no interest in backing down either. It seems they believe they can simply weather this storm. Traditionally, conservatives are anti-porn. There's a segment of the left that is as well. When influencers and news outlets who should be covering this and calling for its end seem to give up on the story or have no interest in it at all, well, it seems they think betting on censorship is sure to win. This will kill the internet. So let's go through some updates, dive into some places we didn't before, and talk about what all of this might mean. 1. Updates on gaming. In my previous entry in this unfortunately continuing series, I talked about the Australian faux feminist group Collective Shout and their attacks on gaming. As noted at the time, despite Collective Shout saying that Valve and itch might have overreacted a bit, going beyond Shout's initial goals and targeting them, they were pleased with the outcome. While they originally targeted taboo erotic material, their website makes clear that they were always going to go after all erotic games. Their past behavior also makes it clear they won't be happy to stop there. Games like Grand Theft Auto and Detroit Become Human have also wound up in their crosshairs, though as of time of writing, they've been less successful in their campaigns against more mainstream games. As I stated in that essay, this will not end at the icky things, nor will it end at erotic art, nor will it end at video games. Collective Shout is a group that is, at the end of the day, anti-sex, anti-erotica, anti-bodily autonomy, and anti-art. It appears others are coming around to that realization. Bigoted asshole Caitlin Roper, the campaigns manager for Collective Shout who hates trans people's surrogacy and sex workers, said, "Our work focuses on combating the sexual objectification and exploitation of women and girls, so we focus our energy there. Legality is not the defining factor. It is about documented evidence of harm to women and girls. In the eyes of some sex-negative feminists, objectification is the mechanism through which patriarchy exists. As I mentioned in the previous essay in this series, Catherine McKinnon claims that the subject-object distinction is how gender exists. Femaleness, then, would have nothing to do with one's chromosomes, gametes, or visible genitalia. If you're the subject, you're a male. If you're the object, you're a female. While there is some truth to this, sexism does often present itself through political and cultural objectification. It's also silly, isn't it? It means gay men who objectify each other are constantly jumping back and forth between man and woman. Of course, Collective Shout can only partially agree with this. To fully agree with McKinnon, someone of the idiotic anti-sex tradition they hold, they would have to say that trans women are women because they constantly experience sexual objectification. They would have to believe in non-binary identity because gay men like me would be bouncing back and forth. Now, there is a difference between sexual objectification in the political arena, resulting in active, lasting dehumanization, attacks on one's rights, discrimination, and so on, and in the realm of pure sexuality. There are many men and women who enjoy being objectified in a sexual environment, not as a statement of their lasting fundamental personhood or their political beliefs. The psychological reasons behind kinks are complex and nuanced. Sometimes this results in interests in non-con, dub-con, transformation, vor, animalification, BDSM, and other kinks. Sometimes it merely results in someone who is submissive in the bedroom. Now, if Collective Shout cared at all about sex and psychology, they might actually wind up in support of all of those genres, especially games which depict kinks which are physically impossible in our world. Why? Because repressed sexuality will always sublimate into some other energy. If you cannot satisfy your interests in objectification, whether you fantasize about being the subject or object in these fantasies, your repressed drives might result in political expressions of them. That's not a great outcome if you care about women. We should be increasing the output and acceptability of erotic art as an outlet for these desires. For instance, many men in the alpha male manosphere community are, in my opinion, straight men with a repressed daddy kink. They long to be submissive, but they cannot bring themselves to submit to women because that's deviant to patriarchy. They can't bring themselves to lovingly submit to other men either because that would be gay, even if it weren't expressly sexual. How can a straight man sexually submit to another straight man, you might ask? A cuck fetish is a good example. The cuck is a submissive role, whereas the bull, so to speak, is a dominant role, and yet everyone is only sexually interacting in a straight relationship. If, say, we allowed the minigames about forced femme, also known as sissification, these men might find an impossible outlet to explore these desires in a far less politically destructive way. This would also be true with micro-macro games, vor, transformation, and omegaverse, where lady alphas would use their pheromones on manly omegas. Of course, Collective Shout doesn't care about any of that. This is in part because they simply do not understand sex. They have no interest in doing any exploration of it. They don't care about art or its actual effects on people. They don't care about sublimation. Since their founder thinks pornography addiction is a real thing, it is not. It's safe to say that they don't really care for science in any way, shape, or form, in my opinion. And based on comments they've made about women's lack of ability to consent to certain sexual acts, anti-abortion comments from its leaders, and more, they don't particularly seem to care about women either. They care about restricting speech and expression for reactionary conservative reasons. Unfortunately, they are right that some of the games they first targeted were likely illegal in Australia. This is because Australia has terrible protections for speech and art. This is not a fundamental issue with the games in question, it's an issue with Australian law that its citizens need to take a stand against. Your government is anti-art. It wants to control your ability to express yourself. It wants to control the art you can make and ingest. You should find that disgusting and work hard to change it. The seeming solution would have been to geo-block these games from Australia until they get their house in order about protecting art and speech over there. But, as Roper made clear, they don't care about legality. They targeted these games on a global level. And the payment processors and credit cards they complained to decided they were right. Speech and art must be restricted and destroyed by Puritans who don't understand sex or art. When Collective Shout says they're going against games with documented evidence of harm, they don't mean that they have done studies into the harm specific depictions have done to even a single person who has ever lived. Again, they don't care about science. They don't care to think deeply about anything, in my opinion. They care about destroying speech. By documented harm, they mean depictions of things they consider harmful. They will go after any game in which a woman is harmed in any form. They will go after games in which women are sexualized in any form. They do not care if those games are by and for women. Yuri will receive the same vitriol as straight people nonsense, whatever you call straight stuff in manga. Genshin Impact won't be targeted because it's barely disguised gambling aimed at children, but rather because there are female enemies in sensual outfits. This is fundamentally different from critique, by the way. This is not what Anita Sarkeesian was doing. One can and should feel free to criticize art. Criticism is good and important, regardless of whether I agree with your critiques or not. There's nothing wrong with an Anita Sarkeesian style analysis of the sexualization of women in popular games with a focus on objectification and a contrast to how the male characters are handled. If one wants to talk about how the women in Marvel Rivals are sexualized to the male gaze while the men, when sexualized, are often also tailored to the male gaze, that's perfectly fine. In fact, it might be interesting. It might inspire current and future artists to approach their work in different ways. Collective Shout isn't interested in critique, though, because that would require thinking and good faith. They're not interested in either of those things. What they are interested in is destroying erotic art entirely and then moving on to violent video games in their entirety. They aim to destroy art itself. Criticism runs against their goals because criticism aims to improve the state of art. To improve something is to wish it continues. Collective Shout is an extremist conservative anti-speech group. They are not invested in the continuation of art. That they feel emboldened in the aftermath of the mass censorship on itch and Steam, despite the outrage, is concerning. It's almost demoralizing. It makes it seem as if perhaps the side of speech in art is currently losing. We cannot lose. If you're an artist of any sort, and especially if you're a content creator, I hate that term, remotely on the broad left spectrum, you have a duty to defend art. I am sorry if that is annoying and scary, I get it, but we must. We owe it to ourselves, our work, our fellows, and those who will walk in our footsteps. My update on Collective Shout is that they're continuing to shout about how much they hate art and long to destroy it. Great. That's not surprising, but it's good sometimes to remind people of the predictable. Now let's move on a little bit. The Stormfront Steam, while publicly pushing back against MasterCard, seems to also be giving in to censorship pushes. Game developers have recently reported instances of Steam disallowing their games to be available through early access, often a critical source of revenue for developers and specific projects. According to Anna Valen, Steam told a developer, "Your app has failed our review because we're unable to support the early access model of development for a game with mature themes." Why might Steam do this? Is it out of fear that developers might attempt to sneak in banned content as they update the game? Well, that's silly because that's possible for any game in early access. You can upload a game with no immediate mature themes and then try to sneak in an update with every explicit taboo kink you can think of. That is stupid and likely to get you banned, but it's not an issue with early access as a concept. That is an issue with bad actors, and they can behave poorly on any genre. Is this, rather, a slow walk to the complete ban of erotic games on Steam? Rather than focusing on erotic video games and what it means for them, though, I want to narrow in on the wording used by Steam here because it's quite interesting and concerning. They did not say they couldn't support early access for games with erotic content. They said mature themes. That is incredibly vague and far-reaching. If that sort of language doesn't concern you, it probably should. Mature themes can mean almost anything. Death, grief, mental illness, violence, horror, monetary concerns, slavery, sex, marriage, gore, cursing, crudeness. The way this is worded, Steam might deny early access to anything like Disco Elysium, What Happened to Edith Finch, Call of Duty, Tales of Arise, Genshin Impact, those weird surgery games people used to play all the time, that edgy buddy game where you'd attack the little circle person with all sorts of eccentric weapons, Hades, Mass Effect, Baldur's Gate, and on and on and on. Why in the hell would they word it like that? I'm quite certain that the people in charge of Steam are well aware of the difference between saying mature themes, erotic themes, and erotic content. Mature themes is the broadest possible one of the three categories. Erotic themes is itself incredibly broad and rather hard to define. Erotic content can have a specific definition, though it's also not as easy to pin down as people want to pretend. Don't worry, we will get to it. Here's what Polygon had to say about it. Valve's shotgun approach saw titles that featured mature themes, not necessarily explicit sex, caught in the crossfire. Despite playing nice with payment processors, Steam's still getting pushed around by them. I find this move by Steam to be concerning. It's a step forward in the censoring department, and it seems to be setting up the foundation for an intense, nearly all-encompassing crackdown on games. Is Steam aiming to become the new Roblox or something? I have not seen any updates from itch.io regarding their supposed attempts to search for a new payment processor that will allow developers of erotic games to once again make money for their art. I would like to reiterate what I did in my previous essay. Itch is incredibly late to this game. They've been aware of Stripe and PayPal's stances on erotic content since at least 2023, and should have been aware of it and their dangers since 2020 at the latest, when banks and processors went after OnlyFans. Over on the subreddit for NSFW game developers, I haven't seen any concrete suggestions of what developers who can no longer make use of itch ought to do. While Steam is, for now, allowing erotic content, the future of it does not seem certain. It does contain censorious guidelines, and publishing on Steam requires some capital investment of your own. Various suggestions have been made, sites that use the same payment processors and cards as Itch and Steam, but because they haven't been targeted so far, have not been given the same censorship pushes. Of course, if they become popular, those sites will find themselves facing the very same dilemmas those storefronts are currently facing. It's not a great suggestion. Other people have said maybe it should be good to follow the Japanese model where erotic content that pushes the boundaries of American sensibilities is allowed. Just look through a yaoi tag on a manga site, but at the same time, you literally cannot show genitalia. Everything has to be pixelated and censored. Is that a worthy trade-off? For some, I'm sure it is. For others, I'm sure it isn't. For me, it represents a form of anti-art censorship that I would still be opposed to, even if the ability to monetize erotic art in more categories is vastly superior to having it entirely banned due to payment processors and credit card companies deciding that they are actually in charge of how people spend their money. Vague, flaccid suggestions regarding cryptocurrency have been made as well. Often this is widely rejected. Crypto carries a reputation for scams, quite probably because of all of the scams. For crypto to be viable, it would have to be at least semi-stable, and the coin itself would have to find a reputation for legitimacy, something that will be hard-won. At the very least, it does present a potential future if we lose the current battle for art. I say current battle because this is an unending war, one that anti-sex activists are incapable of winning. Erotic art is one of the oldest genres. It has existed since we started making art and will last until the human race ceases existing. No amount of whining from aesthetic conservatives will be able to change that. That they are destined to lose in the long run, however, is a bit of a cold comfort to this very moment. Erotic games remain under attack. PayPal, Stripe, Visa, MasterCard, and Collective Shout show no signs of backing down or giving a single iota of a shit about art. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like many political commentators, games journalists, erotic artists across disciplines, and artists in general are willing to take a prolonged stance in defense of erotic art. It's tempting, after all, to simply give in to the demands of places like Amazon. While they disallow erotica and romance that remotely deals with the taboo, unless you're traditionally published, in which case almost anything goes, lol, they do allow literary erotica. Just work within the restrictions. For now, that means narrowing your output to the restrictions on Steam as forced on them by payment processors, credit cards, and Collective Shout. It means not making any money at all on itch. Maybe you can make money by utilizing Patreon and itch, though of course you'd then have to follow Patreon censorious guidelines. Personally, I find that to be a cowardly stance. More importantly, 2. The problem with genre. In the previous entries in this series of essays, we talked about the difficulty of pinning down genre. One of the only genres that's easy to define is romance, and that genre romance must focus on a love story that ends with a happily ever after or a happily for now if it's a series. What defines erotica? The go-to answer would be that it is in the prurient interest, meaning it's designed to turn someone on. The problem here is what turns someone on is incredibly vague. There are plenty of fetish art pieces that are entirely safe for work. Plenty of vore fiction, if read straightforwardly without the context that this is a fetish, comes across as straight horror, despite being written with the intention to be erotic. Authorial intention is also hard to determine. More than that, it is not the only valid form of analysis. Within the prurient interest is a determination that makes erotica purely dependent on the cultural moment in which it's ingested. Things made to be erotic hundreds of years ago may be seen as chaste or entirely non-sexual now. Are we meant to determine if they're erotic art based on the time in which they were written or the time in which they're consumed? Should we evaluate based on authorial intentions, and how do we know those? What if an author lies or doesn't understand their work? What if they write something incredibly erotic in nature while intending to write something stomach-churning and horrifying? This is a consistent problem. Where are the lines that lie between romance, erotica, erotic romance, and romantic erotica? If you say you know where those lines are, you are lying to yourself. Where's the line between dark romance and horror? Where's the line between horror and erotica? Where's the line between religion and erotica? Guido Reni's many portraits of Saint Sebastian are erotic. That does not make them erotica. Would a video game which is about classic works of art, especially those by Caravaggio, be seen as an adult game worthy of being banned? Those artworks often combine violence and sexuality. That is banned on nearly every platform. It's the sort of thing that payment processors and credit card companies hate, and yet it's almost the entirety of the history of art. What do we do when sex itself is a sort of violence? What do we do when the nature of horror as a genre is nearly always sexual? When these companies go after erotica, what level of spice are you allowed before they consider it crossing the line? Are sex scenes allowed in other genres? Do you have to be vague? Is implying or discussing sex past the limit? What if those scenes can be seen as being written with the intention of exciting a reader in that moment? What about films that show no penetration but which have sensual scenes clearly meant to entice the viewer? The problem isn't merely with the difficulty of determining genre, it's with the restrictions. Say you make an adventure RPG game. The combat involves attacking and killing monsters. You have companions whom you can romance and bed. This should be familiar to many of you. It's the Dragon Age style of doing things. Now, Dragon Age does not depict genitalia or penetration, but it does start sex scenes. It shows you glimpses of the intimacy. It cuts away, but you know sex has happened. You saw moments of intimacy. These scenes are meant to be erotic. What do you do in this instance? What if a game is more explicit in those sex scenes? The game is still not primarily genre erotica. It is still an adventure RPG. Would policies against the combining of violence and erotica ban the game? What if you are a game that's more equally balanced between erotica and action, still without putting violence in the erotic moments? When sites like OnlyFans ban the use of blood, they stifle the genre. This isn't merely because fake blood can't be used in erotic films, art, or photography. It's because it prevents films from being made in which explicit horror or action surround the scenes of erotica. You can't make a slasher in which two of the leads escape the monster and celebrate through having sex with each other. This is fundamentally stifling to art as a whole. It prevents erotica from exploring other areas of the human condition. It prevents it from growing and getting better. It prevents other genres from exploring sex. It holds up classic pieces of art and declares that they cannot be made today, not due to a lack of talent, but because you are no longer to make money off of them, because they make those poor credit card companies uncomfortable. It can even be difficult to establish what is and isn't the line on these taboo parts of erotica. For instance, when Dubcon is banned, this tends to include any consumption of all drugs and alcohol. After all, being intoxicated goes against strict definitions of consent. So you're not allowed to use poppers, despite those generally being used in the middle of an already consensual meeting. Two lovers aren't allowed to get tipsy at their wedding and go back to the hotel room to consummate the marriage, something they were clearly already going to do. You can't toast. It includes all instances of consensual non-consent, where it's clear that the characters are consenting and role-playing. It includes all instances of hypnosis, even in, say, a moment where one character desperately wants to engage in an activity with their partner, but their body won't allow them for whatever reason, so they undergo hypnosis, not to make them consent to something they wouldn't otherwise consent to, but to allow them to engage in behavior they already want to engage in. This also results in banning common sexual practices. Say your partner suggests that they'd love to be woken up to you having breakfast in bed, to put it in terms that YouTube might not despise me for, but for which I despise myself for using. Strictly speaking, this is consensual. However, because they are necessarily asleep when the eating begins, this will be seen as dubcon at best and be banned. Free use, a consensual BDSM dynamic with rules and safe words, is also likely to be banned in these instances under the ideas of dubcon. Omegaverse fiction with its use of pheromones is widely swept up in these bans. What qualifies as bestiality? You might assume, as a normal person would, to be fair, that this would be, coitus with an animal. That's not quite true, though. Bans here often include general monster-based erotica. Shifters can be targeted. Smashwords specifically makes clear that fictional creatures like centaurs and forsonas do not qualify as bestiality to them. They have to clarify this because they have a specific categorization system that they need to be as accurate as possible. Other places do include all of those things, so they have to let you know that they don't. If you trust some of the authors giving advice to other erotica authors over on Reddit, Amazon's ban on this includes any animalistic feature, including nodding, as that's a trait seen in other animals but not in humans. Fansly claims that payment processors have forced them to ban all furry content, though they still allow kimono mimi, people with animal ears and tails and the like. I would guess, however, that these kimono mimi wouldn't be allowed to use their tails in a sexual situation. Bans on fictionalized incest, one of the categories that give many people the ick, to be fair, while at the same time being one of the most historically popular categories of erotica and romance, also seems easy to pin down, but is it? In-laws are often included in faux-cest ban. Let's say there are two sons in one family while the other has a son and a daughter. If there's one straight marriage, and then the two remaining guys get together after that marriage, this would be banned. Or even if they were together before that marriage, suddenly bannable. There are plenty of examples in art history and history of a widow getting together with her brother-in-law. At that point in time, strictly speaking, they are not related. However, this coupling would likely get banned on many of these sites. That touches on another thing. Bans on snuff, as I discussed in the first essay on the subject, aren't merely about actual snuff, the sexualized depiction of real-life death. Colloquially, we call any film that depicts actual death a snuff film, regardless of erotic intent. Censorious anti-art platforms, credit cards, and payment processors view depictions of fictionalized death to be snuff. They view actions that would perhaps kill a normal human but don't do so in the fictional world to also be snuff. An erotic parody of Death Becomes Her would be banned. It places erotic depictions of the undead in a gray space. What about depictions of the afterlife? What about a scene where a funeral or grief brings two people together? Screwing the tears away has somewhat of a chance of being banned. This often prevents erotica from including non-erotic death and violence. Why is that? Because it's fundamentally not about sex or about icky kinks. It has nothing to do with understanding fantasy or sexuality. It has nothing to do with protecting anyone. It is about destroying art. Now, let's talk a bit more about one of the companies destroying art, in my opinion. 3. PayPal. For a bit of a refresher from the previous two essays, PayPal back in 2012 went after literary self-publisher Smashwords, attempting to force them into adopting stricter censorship guidelines. This led to a similar, though not entirely one-to-one situation as to what itch.io is currently facing. The literary community did not take this sitting down. PayPal eventually stood down. Authors were allowed to continue making money from selling legal fiction. For a time, this seemed to be the solution everyone landed on. But now, PayPal seems to feel emboldened, perhaps, because Smashwords through Draft2Digital allows direct bank payments and no longer has to rely entirely on PayPal for payout. They seemed to have returned to their policy of beginning the sale and purchase of erotic literature. A Reddit user from the UK reported that purchasing erotic ebooks with their PayPal is the reason their account was banned. As of the time of writing, Smashwood still allows the sorts of content this user was banned for buying to continue to be sold. My first thought upon reading this is that they decided, PayPal, to adopt a sort of decriminalizing policy in regards to erotica. While they may allow authors to sell it, through Smashwords at least, it seems they don't allow people to buy it. This is the same thing as banning it. There is no doubt in my mind that PayPal will soon be going after Smashwords once again. Anna Valens reported that another person's PayPal account was nuked after they purchased an erotic game on itch before such games were delisted from the platform. An article in The Gamer reports that after being effectively debanked everywhere else, a developer had their PayPal nuked and the thousands of pounds they had in there kept by the company. Now yes, this is a violation of PayPal's bullshit terms of service. It's also a great reminder that if you use PayPal, you should never keep your money there. Withdraw as much as you can as soon as you can. PayPal seems to be ramping up their crackdown on erotica across the internet. They show no interest in turning their back on censorship and no interest in protecting or understanding art. They do seem, though, quite interested in upping their attacks. This is concerning. 4. Debanking. Despite all the focus on payment processors and credit card companies who should rightly draw the ire and protest of anyone who cares at all about art and speech, as has been mentioned before by me and others, the problems do not end there. For a long time now, sex workers, including those who simply write erotica or act in erotic films, have been debanked. Debanking is the process by which one's accounts are closed. They are not allowed to receive loans or continue to receive payments or pay from that bank. If this happens enough times, as with what supposedly happened to the developer in our last section, you run out of places to go. You either have to keep all of your money in cash or assets that you are in direct control of, unbanked, difficult to deal with, and highly susceptible to loss from disaster or physical theft. If you keep all your assets in a safe, what do you do when something happens to said safe? Well, you effectively have no money at all. How do you handle that? What are you meant to do when the financial institutions look at your constitutionally protected speech and say you're not allowed to use them to accept or make payments because you engaged in said constitutionally protected speech? The government isn't doing anything to restrict your speech in this instance, so it isn't really a violation of your free speech rights for them to decide what speech you are and aren't allowed to engage in or make money from, them being the banks here. It feels like it should be, but strictly speaking, it isn't. One solution to this would be a U.S. national bank. Created and overseen by the federal government, it would be constitutionally prohibited from engaging in anything similar to viewpoint discrimination or censorship on protected speech and art, like the creation and sale of erotica. There is a chance, of course, that this national bank would engage in the same thing all of the other banks' credit cards and payment processors do. When they are caught with their fingers in the censorship pie, they'll claim it's because adult content is a volatile part of the market with too high a column of chargebacks. Is this a real excuse, or is it mostly just bullshit meant so they can continue engaging in their beloved censorship? Based on the recent actions and attitudes they've taken toward the censorship of gaming, it seems pretty clear that this is merely an excuse to do what they already wanted to do: attack art and speech. Another potential solution would be to push for debanking legislation. This is a potential route highlighted by The Gamer in an article I found a bit annoying because they felt the need to censor specific words. I'm sure for some idiotic reasons being pushed by Google on websites, effectively attacking and killing language itself. Don't worry, we'll talk about that in another essay soon. They specifically point to legislation by North Dakotan Senator Kevin Cramer, Senate Bill 401, the Fair Access to Banking Act. This bill effectively makes illegal the act known as debanking, sort of, and also only for huge financial institutions. Such things may be allowed on a person-by-person basis if that person fails to meet risk-based standards. What constitutes risk? Well, volatile industries and industries with high chargeback rates. Again, it seems this might allow the continued debaking of erotic artists, though it does seem like it would at least protect those who engage in purchasing, so long as they themselves aren't engaging in the chargeback-friendly fraud issue. You could then assume that this, in turn, might lead to a lower amount of chargebacks in the erotica zone, eventually leading to this often blamed risk no longer standing in the way of the legal sale and purchase of erotic art, because those who were doing the friendly fraud thing might be seen on a person-to-person level and be like, oh, nope, can't do that anymore. So maybe there is something here. This bill was co-sponsored entirely by Senate Republicans. No action has been taken on it since February as of time of recording. Its companion legislation in the House has likewise not been acted upon. Hearing that this bill was proposed by members of the GOP might give you pause. After all, it's the Republican Party that is traditionally anti-art, anti-sex, anti-porn, and anti-speech when it comes to the above. Look at the recent calls regarding Charlie Kirk. Project 2025 called for the criminalization of porn. You are right to be skeptical. Here's what Senator Kramer said on his website when he introduced the legislation. When progressives failed at banning these entire industries, what they did instead is they turned to weaponizing banks as sort of a backdoor to carry out their activist goals. The Fair Access to Banking Act enacts strict penalties for categorically discriminating against legal industries and individuals. Kramer is specifically concerned with forcing financial institutions to do business with crypto, fossil fuels, and firearms. He also mentions generalized debanking, though the statement doesn't spend nearly as much time on that idea. Theoretically, this would forcibly end the debanking of sex workers and those who purchase erotic art. Again, it's theoretical. I put that caveat out there for three reasons. First, as mentioned before, there's still a decent chance banks, credit cards, and payment processors would point to risk as a reason to deny and close the accounts of those who sell erotic art. There is potential that it could limit the ability of buyers to engage in friendly fraud, though. I'm uncertain how it would ultimately shake out. It could be a fix, it could not. Second, the history of one of the bill's co-sponsors is not great when it comes to defending legal erotic speech. When Indiana Senator Jim Banks was a congressman, he signed a letter to Trump's then Attorney General William Barr, incorrectly determining that pornography is de facto obscene and therefore illegal. He called for Barr to practically shut down all distribution of erotica. This is anti-art, anti-speech, and anti-First Amendment. Doing what Banks requested would be violating the Constitution. Third, the ability to do this seems to be an open legal question. Though it pains me to think so, the question of debanking struck me instinctively as a potential First Amendment issue, not with Banks violating people's free speech because that's not really how the First Amendment works. Rather, a voice started whispering questions in the back of my head like, would a law like this violate the First Amendment rights of financial institutions? When I attempted to Google this question, I didn't come across much help. There were people who argued Congress has broad power to regulate banks. There were others who claimed it would be a violation in the form of compelled speech and association. Others even argued that this would be compulsion, but it might be permitted. In my confusion, I reached out to my friend Violet. She's a law student who writes interesting articles like this one discussing questions of consent and consent by proxy. I thought it was a fascinating article. She told me, I think your question ultimately hinges on if you view banking as a fundamental commercial association or if you view it as expressive. Commercial speech and association may be protected, but they're less protected than expressive speech. So then the government would have less of a hurdle in proving a compelling governmental interest in restricting it. But overall, it's likely an issue where Congress would have to try passing it and see what the courts say in the aftermath. This is to say, this is a potential route, but there are challenges here. I don't really trust the people pushing the bill. They certainly do not seem to intend for it to defend erotic art and sex workers, though my best estimate is that there's a decent chance that's what it would wind up doing if it passed, so maybe it's a good thing. I spend a good amount of my time critiquing and shitting on Republicans. On the vast majority of issues, they and I do not agree. Yet here's the dirty truth of politics. You sleep with dogs, you get fleas, you feel a bit sick in the morning, but if you manage to get what you wanted or needed in a specific instance, you suck it the hell up, you scratch the flea bites, and you cheer 'cause you won. Politics is not for the pure. No one who is in it can ever stay pure. If Republican politicians decide their interest in debanking is worth protecting the free speech of Americans, erotic artists, and consumers of erotica, then this once I'll give them a hand. Of course, Democrats ought to be getting in on this as well. The ACLU should be making noise in opposition to the actions of these banks, payment processors, and credit cards. If need be, bait the Republicans into passing a bill like that by pushing hard for a central bank or some other such thing as a solution to this problem. Maybe even go for their dreaded central bank digital currency, that is, crypto upheld by and tied to the US dollar controlled by the Fed. If you are concerned about debanking, then here you go, an institution that is constitutionally barred from restricting free speech or engaging in political discrimination. Take advantage of the current moment to push for it with gamers. Push and bait until some sort of bill pops up between the two parties that ends this nonsense control that financial institutions believe they are entitled to enact and exert over the American people. 5. Age verification. I suppose we need to crash back down to reality. The Kramer bill has gone nowhere since February of 2025. I'm writing this in September. At the moment, it seems the United States Congress has no interest in taking action to defend the speech of American citizens, which is why you must contact your representatives and voice your concerns about private companies acting as if they can control what you can and cannot do with your own money. Make a fuss about it. Be annoying. Continue to call and email payment processors, credit cards, and acquiring banks. Talk about it all over social media. Encourage your favorite content creators, whether they are streamers, gamers, video essayists, or, God forbid, TikTokers, to talk about this issue and raise the alarm. Especially because what the US Congress seems far more interested in than regulating the financial market or pressuring it to back off on censorship of legal speech is further restricting the internet. Rolling Stone reports. While U.S. officials such as Vice President J.D. Vance and House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan have derided the Online Safety Act as a path to censorship, at least 19 states already have laws on the books with similar requirements. Speaking of those bills and what they consider adult content worthy of forcing a site to include age verification, Rolling Stone further says, the lack of nuance in the legislative language means anything from LGBTQ-centered information to diverse authors could be considered explicit. Molly Buckley of the Electronic Frontier Foundation voiced concerns with Rolling Stone that the government having access to these databases might very well lead to states with, say, abortion bans, potentially trying to track citizens who attempt to research getting an abortion out of state. We've already seen how expansive this can get. In the UK, under their new Online Safety Act, age verification is needed for YouTube, Wikipedia, Spotify, Discord, Blue Sky, and many other sites. Over in the EU, according to Politico, one of the third-party companies that was responsible for this verification in France is potentially leaking information about people visiting pornographic websites. Uh-oh. It seems like the lack of data protection people like the Electronic Frontier Foundation have been warning about for years in regards to age verification laws are going to lead to a lot of mess, including heavy potential for blackmail. What's that quote Republicans love to use when it comes time to do something about children getting mowed down by semi-automatic weapons in schools? Something along the lines of, if you give up your freedom in exchange for safety, you'll have neither. But this is to protect the children, right? At least there's an admirable goal there, right? Surely this isn't another example of a conservative group dressing up their reactionary goals in progressive language like with collective shouts faux feminism, right? Ah, well, here's what one of the authors of Project 2025 said. We've got a number of states that are passing this, and the porn company then says we're not doing business in your state, which is, of course, entirely what we're after. We're doing it from the back door, starting with the kids. We would have a national ban on pornography if we could. I've reiterated this time and time again, but it's important to note in this context, Project 2025 does not use in the prurient interest in their definition of pornography. They do not care if it is genre erotica. They include any and all mention, discussion, and inclusion of trans people and trans identity. Their definition of porn is so malleable as to include any speech they wish to destroy. Their goal is to crush speech. In the age of the internet, the way to do that is to crush the internet itself. I'm going to retread some ground from my first censorship video, so bear with me here, but it's important to my point. Of these verification measures, an article in the Scientific American says, this poses obvious opportunities for hacking, theft, and extortion. They interview Professor Olivier Blasi, who says, the worst example would be if you directly collected people's name and the type of website they're trying to access. Then someone could establish a list of who follows certain content, which could be used to target groups such as LGBTQ+ people. That would be terrible. We know that establishing lists is a very bad idea. When he talks about the dangers of the various methods of verification, he talks about how facial recognition would require storing biometric data. This is my own wondering, but with the proliferation of AI and the use of AI by some abusive people to non-consensually make intimate content of people, what happens if that data is hacked? Beyond privacy, safety, and identity theft concerns, now there's a concern over the further creation of AI porn stealing people's faces. That article links to a different one by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which warns if a website misuses or mishandles the data, the visitor might never find out. And if they do, they might lack an adequate enforcement mechanism. For example, one recent age verification law requires a user to prove damages resulting from the unlawful retention of data in order to hold the website accountable in court, a difficult bar to reach. FOSTA is a 2018 law that aims to fight sex trafficking by reducing legal protections for online platforms. The conflation of consensual sex work with sex trafficking, as well as the threat of litigation for websites, has already led to a crackdown, as Megan Farrick-Manish for The Verge puts it. They were supposedly protecting the victims of sex trafficking, a legitimate issue that plagues the countries flat the world. And yet, they're not actually protecting anyone. The obvious question about FOSTA SESTA is, did it work? An article from The Nation says, 5 years later, reports from legal scholars, researchers, and the Government Accountability Office conclude that the law has been counterproductive at best and deadly at worst. By most accounts, online sex trafficking remains rampant. To date, October 2023, there has been just one criminal conviction under the law. Oh, so it doesn't work. Oops. But what has it done? As that same article puts it, to avoid serious criminal and civil liabilities, many websites and apps now over-regulate all erotic content, much of which is unrelated to sex work. Sarah Rahman argues in Book Riot that self-published erotica has faced increased censorship because of FOSTA. Despite erotica having quite literally nothing to do with trafficking, if you're given an excuse and you like censorship, why not take it? Or if you're afraid, just go ahead and do stupid things just in case. While talking about Tumblr's ban on adult content, Jason Kobler and Samantha Cole write about FOSTA's effects. Sites have cracked down on NSFW communities are shut down altogether for fear of repercussions of hosting adult content. When platforms attempt to restrict content out of this kind of fear, especially when they have a large user base, they don't have many options. Human moderation would require a large increase in hiring, and famously, Tumblr is broke. Supposedly, at that point in time, they were losing like $30 million a year. What you're going to do then is attempt to use filters and auto mods. The Electronic Frontier Foundation points out the filtering system ended up accidentally targeting the post of a blogger who was posting patent designs. They say, Tumblr employs an automated system incapable of being nuanced, resulting in absurd results. Tumblr says it has to use these tools because it's the only thing that can work on a large scale, but that again misses the point that Tumblr didn't need this policy in the first place. It already had rules against illegal content. Deciding to accede to puritanical notions of what is acceptable was not necessary. Mid-2023, FOSTA was clarified and restricted by the D.C. Circuit Court. David Green opines that it's unfortunate the law wasn't overthrown in its entirety, but the court gave some extreme clarifications. He writes, "We appreciate that the court significantly limited its previous broad reach." He lays out a series of cases that make it seem like platforms such as social media do not aid and abet when they are generally aware of an overall unlawful enterprise. The intermediary must instead knowingly assist a specific wrongful act, and they have to take some affirmative action with intent of facilitating the commission of a specific offense. Okay, FOSTA doesn't work. The suggested verification systems pushed by certain states are ripe for mass abuse and are also easy to skirt around with a VPN, so those theoretically don't work. But both have been effective at censoring the internet. Even with the DC court case, FOSTA's effects can still be felt. There's that Stafford Beer idea: the purpose of a system is what it does. That means its purpose can't be what it fails to do. FOSTA fails to prevent sex trafficking. It succeeds in causing censorship. In that case, its purpose is the censorship, as are many of these policies we've been talking about. 6. Anonymity and the death of the internet. What happens when payment processors, credit card companies, banks, conservative reactionaries, swerfs, and anti-art people band together to restrict the free expression and legal speech of adults online while at the same time insisting on de-anonymizing the internet. I want to walk together through some scenarios and seriously consider the death of the internet. Let's start with the idea of competition in the free market. If financial institutions band together to restrict speech and destroy the art that they don't like for whatever reason, then theoretically a new market member should rise up ready to fill that gap, right? The problem is that Smashwords was attacked in 2012. It has been 13 years, and as far as I can see, there is still currently no major or even credible competitor to Visa and MasterCard that is willing or able to handle the speech that those two wish would be illegal despite being legal in the United States. While CC Bill is a payment processor that is less censorious than the likes of Stripe and PayPal, it is still beholden to the restrictions of Visa and MasterCard. Crypto has not risen to fill this arena where it could actually be useful because many of the tech bros behind cryptocurrency were not interested in filling a place in the market or serving even as a currency. They were interested in scams, tricking venture capitalists, and getting rich off big promises of the tech of tomorrow. I have no idea how long it would take for any sort of remotely trustworthy or stable coin to emerge that would take this spot in the market and allow for the flourishing of art and legal speech. Okay? In that case, artists aren't able to get paid and consumers aren't allowed to buy any erotic art that Visa and MasterCard find offensive. But surely they can still be posted for free, right? We can still have forum sites dedicated to them. We can still post little blogs about them and host our own websites, right? Well, maybe. Until you realize that these domains have to be paid for. They have to be hosted. The hosts have to spend money on servers. There are bills to be paid and there's money to be made. What happens when credit card companies, payment processors, and that entire group of anti-art reactionaries decide to take the next step to targeting the financials of anyone who hosts this sort of content on their own dime? Speech is banned. A chill spreads over the internet. These companies get to smile. They know now they can control the internet. As long as they take one step at a time and don't go too far too fast, they can be the ones who get to determine what we are and aren't allowed to say. Erotica moves entirely offline. It's all physical media paid for in cash. Conventions are held, you go to a booth and you fork over $20 for a flash drive or an SD card with a porno already loaded onto it. Erotica is printed out by individuals or small collectives and sold in little groups. Even Amazon, when they stand alone, will likely bow to pressure and rid itself of all self-published erotica. And then, of course, it'll move to the traditionally published stuff. And yet still, even after all of this is gone, you'll have to prove who you are on every website you wish to browse because the threat of erotic material is still there. What if people try to post it anyway? What if they speak in codes? What if they hide their erotica in the layers of other images? What if we decide new things are obscene that wouldn't have been considered such just a year ago? We have to protect everyone, so fork over your information. We need to know exactly who you are in order for you to browse Wikipedia. Now everywhere I go knows I'm a gay man as soon as I click on their website. I'm denied when I go to purchase a hotel room for two adults because gay people aren't yet protected from housing discrimination, something you should note and be outraged about, by the way. So despite me potentially buying for any number of other parties, they assume it's me and my future husband. Oh, way, yay, I'm gonna get married one day. They don't want the gays sleeping there. They don't tell me that this is the reason for denying me a room. Project 2025 gets its way. I can now no longer access any website that makes mention of trans people or trans identity. This will inevitably include gender non-conforming dress and behavior. They will then say that being gay is an act of defying the natural order of gender. No longer will I be able to stream Drag Race, Naruto, One Piece, or A Star is Born. Theaters will not be able to sell tickets for Angels in America, Rent, Title of Show, or Hedwig and the Angry Inch. The videos of ContraPoints, Abigail Thorne, and even Blair White will be scrubbed from the internet. Let's get a little less apocalyptic. Say erotica isn't driven off the internet and Project 2025 does not get its way. Yet still, you must provide your ID to access everything. They say your data is secure. They promise they aren't selling it, But we all know that's bullshit. It's always being sold. Your porn habits are logged. That data is sold to other companies. Companies block you from viewing or accessing their websites. Watcher of whatever X pornography is not a protected class. Businesses feel free to discriminate based on those habits. You are no longer allowed to buy anything from China because you watched a Yuri anime. Games ban you because you looked at erotic fan fiction of their characters. You watched a faux cest video one time, and so now you're being denied on your adoption application a decade later, despite never watching it since, or never even fully watching that video. These days, if you don't want your algorithms clogged up due to researching a certain topic, you can always open another browser or pull up in private browsing or simply log out. I do this sometimes when I need to watch YouTube videos on certain topics, but I don't want those topics or video makers to pop up in my suggestions. I sometimes do this when I'm researching for a novel or a play because what I write tends to be quite dark, and I don't necessarily want that tied to my other browsing habits. Uh-oh, though. If you need to research something disturbing, now that'll be tied to your name forever. No context will be given. They promise not to keep this data on you, but you know that's a lie. You have to go to the library to research. You have to comb through old books. They will not be up to date. If you want to use the library's internet, the sites will still know it's you. Whistleblowers will be known and named immediately. People who access the internet in regions managed by restrictive, violent regimes will become known to the people who harm them. Who will harm them. A gay person who has been posting anonymously from Qatar will now be imprisoned. There is no anonymity on the internet any longer. Everything you do is tied to your name. It is sold. We are told this is for our own protection. It is for the protection of children. Everything gets shitter. The third-party verifier now knows your kinks. It knows your insecurities. It has all the information that's perfectly tailored to exploit and blackmail you. Now it just needs a buyer. How long will they get away with selling it like that before anyone notices? If someone notices, will anyone care? These verification systems are currently not cheap. Small websites fold almost the exact moment they're told they have to start verifying ages. Down goes Blue Sky, down goes small forums. Artists no longer have their own websites. No one has their own website, it's too expensive. Nonprofits dedicated to LGBT people or those who have suffered sexual crimes who find themselves incapable of paying the associated fees necessary. After all, those who salivate at these ideas of censorship will not cease to call those sites hosters of mature content. Down goes suicide prevention nonprofits, down go sexual education websites, down go online academic journals, down goes the internet. Everything will be shit AI slob, or it'll be for children. There will be no adult spaces, no adult conversations, no mature themes. There will be no art. There will be no speech. There will be no internet. This is how it all dies. So if you want to live, pick up your phone, pick up a pen, pick up a sign, and make some goddamn noise. Howdy, and thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, share if you're feeling saucy. You can join me over on Patreon if you would like, wherein you'll get these videos and others early. You'll also get to have some fun behind the scenes access to some of my art projects, some more personal vlogging style content, and you'll just get to support me and we'll get to chat about art a whole bunch, which is what I love to do most. You can go over to Amazon Smashwords or wherever you get your ebooks and purchase a copy of my poetry collections, Butterfly Snuff, and A Museum of Art and Eggs, both of which are also available in paperback and hardback. I have a second channel where I'm just reading through a bunch of public domain stuff for the fun of it and through my own work, so you'll get readings of these poetry collections and some short stories and some longer form fiction when I get around to it, and some plays. And I have a third channel where I'm uploading my music and art instead of having it all clog up this channel. So go support those if you feel like it. That content, a lot of it will also be getting uploaded early to Patreon. So if you want all of my stuff in one convenient space, Patreon is the place to go, which would be really cool of you, you know? I hope you have a fantastic day. Do not be rude in the comments. Do not go and harass anybody. And I will see you next time.